The city was burning. Smoke filled the air, thick and black, making it hard to breathe. Buildings that once stood tall were now broken piles of stone and metal. Fires blazed everywhere, painting the night sky orange and red. The sound of explosions echoed through the streets one after another, like thunder that never stopped. Kyle Monroe ran through the chaos with his team behind him. He wore the dark armor of a Terran Federation soldier, his rifle held ready in his hands. Dust covered his face and sweat ran down his forehead. He had been fighting for 3 days straight with almost no rest. His body ached, but he kept moving. That was what soldiers did. They kept moving no matter how tired they were. The mission was simple. Get in, evacuate the civilians who were trapped, and get out before the enemy closed in. Kasara Prime had been a peaceful border world once, a place where humans and Xylothians traded goods and tried to live together. Now it was a war zone. The Xylothian Empire and the Terran Federation were fighting over every inch of ground, and the people caught in the middle paid the price. Kyle's radio crackled in his ear. The voice of his commander came through, broken and fuzzy from all the interference. The message was clear enough, though. They had 15 minutes to reach the evacuation point. After that, the ships would leave with or without them. Enemy forces were advancing fast, and command would not risk losing the transport ships. He looked back at his team. There were 6 of them, all good soldiers who had survived more battles than they could count. They moved quickly through the ruined streets, checking every corner for threats. Behind them came a small group of civilians, mostly humans, but a few aliens too. They were scared, clutching whatever belongings they could carry. Some were injured, leaning on others for support. Kyle checked his watch. 10 minutes left. They were close to the evacuation point now, just a few more blocks. He could see the glow of the landing zone ahead, where the ships waited with their engines running. That was when he heard it. A sound that did not belong. It was faint, almost lost in the noise of the burning city. But Kyle had good ears, trained to pick up things that others might miss. It was crying. A child was crying somewhere nearby. He stopped and held up his fist. His team halted immediately, weapons raised and ready. They formed a protective circle around the civilians, scanning for threats. One of his soldiers, a woman named Harper, moved up beside him. Harper spoke quietly. She asked what was wrong. Kyle pointed to a collapsed building on their left. The crying was coming from there, he said. Harper looked at him with concern. She reminded him they had no time. The ships would leave soon. They had to keep moving. Kyle knew she was right. Every second they delayed put everyone at risk. But he also knew he could not leave a child behind. He told Harper to take the team and the civilians to the evacuation point. He would catch up in a few minutes, Harper argued. She said it was too dangerous to split up. Kyle cut her off with a sharp gesture. That was an order, he told her. Take them to safety. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. She knew better than to waste time arguing when Kyle made up his mind. The team moved out quickly, guiding the civilians toward the landing zone. Kyle turned toward the ruined building. It had once been part of the diplomatic compound, a place where officials from both sides met to discuss peace. Now it was just rubble. Chunks of concrete and twisted metal blocked the entrance. The crying was louder now, coming from somewhere inside. He climbed over the debris, carefully testing each step to make sure it would hold his weight. The structure groaned around him, unstable and ready to collapse at any moment. Smoke poured from cracks in the walls, making his eyes water. He pulled a cloth over his nose and mouth to filter the air. Inside, the building was dark except for the flickering light of small fires. Kyle switched on the light attached to his rifle, sweeping the beam across the wreckage. Furniture lay smashed and scattered. Papers were everywhere, floating like snow. The crying echoed through the empty halls, making it hard to tell exactly where it came from. He called out, his voice calm and steady. He said he was here to help. There was a moment of silence, then the crying started again, more urgent this time. Kyle followed the sound, moving deeper into the building. He had maybe 5 minutes left before he missed the evacuation. He found her in what used to be an office. A large desk had fallen sideways, creating a small shelter. Underneath it, pressed against the wall, was a Xylothian child. She looked to be about 7 or 8 years old, though Kyle was not good at guessing ages for alien species. She had pale blue skin and large dark eyes that stared at him with fear. Her clothes were torn and dirty, and blood stained her left arm where something had cut her. Kyle slowly lowered his rifle and held up his hands to show he meant no harm. The child pressed herself further into the corner, trembling. She spoke in her own language, words Kyle did not understand, but the meaning was clear. She was terrified. He knew what she saw when she looked at him. A human soldier in full combat armor covered in dust and ash, carrying weapons designed to kill her people. He was the enemy. In her mind, he might be there to finish what the bomb started. Kyle did something he was not supposed to do. He reached up and released the seals on his helmet, then pulled it off. The girl's eyes widened as she saw his face for the first time. He was young, maybe 30 years old, with short brown hair and blue eyes. His face was kind despite the exhaustion written across it. He smiled at her, the kind of smile an uncle might give to a scared child. He spoke softly, keeping his voice calm and gentle. He told her his name was Kyle and that he was going to get her out of there. She probably did not understand the words, but she understood the tone. Some things were universal across species. Kyle set his rifle down and moved closer, slow and careful. He reached into one of his pouches and pulled out a medical kit. The girl watched as he opened it and took out bandages and antiseptic. He pointed to her injured arm, then to the supplies, asking without words if he could help. She hesitated, then slowly extended her arm. Kyle worked quickly but gently, cleaning the wound and wrapping it with a clean bandage. She flinched when the antiseptic stung, but she did not pull away. When he finished, he tied off the bandage and gave her another reassuring smile. An explosion rocked the building, much closer than before. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and somewhere in the structure something heavy crashed to the floor. They were running out of time. Kyle picked up his helmet and rifle, then knelt in front of the girl. He gestured to his back, indicating she should climb on. The child understood. She was small and light, and she wrapped her arms around his neck as he stood up. He secured her with one arm, while keeping his rifle ready with the other. He could feel her heart beating fast against his back, could hear her quick, frightened breathing. Kyle moved back through the building as fast as he dared. The structure was more unstable now, groaning and shifting with every step. Fires had spread, blocking some of the paths he had used to enter. He had to find another way out. His radio crackled again. Harper's voice came through, tense and urgent. She reported that they had reached the evacuation point. The ships were preparing to leave. She asked for his location. Kyle told her he was on his way, maybe 2 minutes out. She replied that he needed to hurry because enemy forces were closing in. Kyle found a window that opened onto a lower roof. He climbed through carefully, holding the child secure. Once outside, he could see the landing zone clearly. The transport ships were there, their engines glowing bright in the darkness. People were boarding quickly, urged on by soldiers who kept looking nervously at the surrounding streets. He jumped down from the roof and started running toward the ships. The child bounced on his back but held on tight, her small hands gripping his armor. Kyle's legs burned with effort, his lungs aching from breathing the smoke-filled air. But he pushed harder, knowing he was almost there. That was when the shell hit. The explosion came from somewhere to his right, a massive blast that threw him sideways. Kyle twisted in midair, turning his body to shield the child. They hit the ground hard, sliding across the broken pavement. His armor protected him from the worst of it, but pain shot through his shoulder and ribs. He rolled onto his hands and knees, checking the child quickly. She was scared but unhurt, protected by his body. Kyle forced himself to his feet, ignoring the pain. More explosions followed, walking across the area as enemy artillery found their range. The ship started to lift off, unable to wait any longer. Kyle ran with everything he had left. Harper and 2 other soldiers appeared, laying down covering fire to keep the enemy back. They shouted for him to move faster. One of the ships, smaller than the others, held position just above the ground. A crew member stood in the open doorway, reaching out. Kyle reached the ship and literally threw himself inside with the child still on his back. Harper and the others jumped in right behind him. The crew member hit the door control and the ship lifted off immediately, rising fast into the smoky sky. Kyle collapsed onto the floor, breathing hard. Someone helped remove the child from his back and carried her to a medical station. She looked back at him with those wide, dark eyes, reaching out one small hand before a medic wrapped her in a blanket and began treating her wounds properly. 15 years had passed since the burning city. 15 years since the night Kyle Monroe pulled a terrified child from the rubble and carried her to safety. The war had ended 10 years ago with a treaty that nobody really trusted. Peace existed now, but it was fragile, like thin ice over deep water. One wrong step could break it. Kyle stood in front of the mirror in his quarters, adjusting his uniform. It was different from the combat armor he used to wear. This uniform was for diplomats and advisors, dark blue with silver trim and medals he never asked for. His hair had gray in it now, and lines marked his face that were not there before. War left its marks on everyone, visible or not. He was heading to Meridian Point, a massive space station that floated in neutral territory between human and Xylothian space. A summit was being held there, the most important diplomatic meeting since the war ended. Both sides would negotiate a new treaty, one that might actually last, or it could all fall apart and the fighting would start again. Kyle did not want to go. He had left the military years ago, tired of fighting and killing and watching good people die. He worked as a civilian advisor now, teaching young officers about tactics and strategy. It was quiet work that let him sleep at night, most nights anyway. But the government needed experienced people at the summit, people who understood both war and peace. They asked him to come, and he could not say no. The ship that took him to Meridian Point was comfortable and fast. He spent most of the journey reading briefing documents about the summit. There were hundreds of pages about trade agreements, border disputes, military limitations, and technology sharing. Kyle read them all, but his mind kept wandering back to old memories. Battles he survived, friends he lost, a small child with frightened eyes. He wondered sometimes what happened to her. The report said she was returned to her family, delivered safely to Xylothian space. That was all he knew. No name, no details, just another refugee among thousands, scattered by war and returned when peace came. He hoped she was happy wherever she was. Meridian Point appeared outside the ship's windows, growing larger as they approached. The station was enormous, a city in space built by both humans and aliens working together. It was meant to be a symbol of cooperation, proof that different species could build something beautiful instead of destroying each other. Kyle hoped that was true. The docking process took an hour. Security was intense with multiple checks and scans. Everyone was nervous about the summit. There were people on both sides who did not want peace, who profited from war and fear. The station's security forces were taking no chances. Kyle was met at the docking bay by an aide, a young woman named Chen who seemed to know everything about everyone. She rattled off his schedule as they walked through the station's corridors. There would be meetings, briefings, formal dinners, and informal gatherings where real negotiations happened away from cameras. Kyle nodded along, only half listening. The station was crowded with delegates from dozens of species. Humans walked alongside Xylothians, along with representatives from other alien races who had interests in the treaty. Everyone wore formal clothing, everyone was polite, but Kyle could feel the tension underneath. Smiles did not quite reach eyes. Conversations were careful and measured. Trust was in short supply. The opening ceremony was held in the Grand Hall, a massive room with a high ceiling that showed the stars outside through clear panels. Hundreds of people gathered there, standing in national groups. Kyle found his place with the human delegation, near the front where the important advisors stood. Speeches began, long and formal. The human ambassador spoke about peace and cooperation. The Xylothian ambassador said similar things in their flowing, musical language that translators converted to human speech. Kyle had heard it all before, pretty words that meant little unless backed by action. He let his mind drift, his eyes scanning the crowd without really seeing. Then the Xylothian delegation entered, and Kyle's attention snapped back to focus. They moved with formal grace, their pale blue skin contrasting with their elegant dark robes. At the front walked their lead negotiator, and Kyle felt something strange stir in his memory. She was young for such an important position, probably in her early 20s. She carried herself with confidence despite her youth, her head held high as she walked to the Xylothian section. Her dark eyes swept across the room, taking in everything with sharp intelligence. Kyle stared at her face, trying to understand why it seemed familiar. Something about her features, the way she moved. It tugged at his memory like a half-forgotten song. But that was impossible. He did not know any Xylothian diplomats. His contact with their species had been limited to war, to enemies seen through rifle sights or across devastated battlefields. He shook off the strange feeling and forced himself to focus on the ceremony. It was just his imagination, memories mixing with present reality. War did that sometimes? Made you see ghosts where none existed? After the ceremony ended, people mingled in carefully organized groups. Kyle found himself caught in conversations with other military advisors, discussing security concerns and strategic implications of the treaty. He answered their questions automatically, his mind elsewhere. Across the hall, the young Xylothian diplomat was surrounded by her own people. She spoke with them quietly, her expression serious. Once, just for a moment, her eyes moved across the crowd and landed on Kyle. Their gazes met for perhaps 2 seconds before she looked away, returning to her conversation. Kyle felt that strange recognition again, stronger this time. He pushed it down, telling himself he was being foolish. There were millions of Xylothians in the galaxy. One face could not possibly mean anything. The days that followed were filled with meetings and negotiations. Kyle sat in rooms where diplomats argued over words and documents, where every sentence was debated and every comma mattered. It was exhausting in a different way than war. At least in combat, you knew who your enemy was and what they wanted. Here, everything was hidden behind polite language and careful smiles. He kept seeing the young Xylothian diplomat around the station. She seemed to be everywhere, always working, always in meetings or deep conversations. Kyle learned her name from the briefing documents. Princess Lyanna, daughter of one of the Xylothian ruling families. She was known as a progressive voice, someone who genuinely wanted peace between the species. Kyle found himself watching her sometimes when he thought no one would notice. It bothered him that he could not place why she seemed familiar. He had a good memory for faces, trained by years of needing to recognize friend from foe in the chaos of battle. But this memory remained frustratingly out of reach. Meanwhile, Lyanna was having her own strange experience. She noticed the human military advisor, the older man with gray in his hair and tired eyes. Something about him pulled at her attention in a way she could not explain. She told herself it was nothing, just nerves from the pressure of the summit. But in her private quarters at night, she would take out a small box she had carried with her for years. Inside was a piece of fabric, worn and faded, torn from a uniform. It was all she had from that night 15 years ago when someone saved her life. She had spent years trying to identify the uniform, searching through databases and archives. The information was classified or lost, scattered by the chaos of war. She remembered fragments of that night. Strong arms lifting her, a kind voice she did not understand, blue eyes that looked at her without hatred, a human soldier who chose to save her when he could have left her to die. She had been so young and the memories were hazy, but they had shaped her life. It was because of him, whoever he was, that she believed peace was possible. If a human soldier could show compassion to an enemy child in the middle of war, then maybe the two species were not meant to be eternal enemies. That belief had guided her into diplomacy, had made her fight for this summit even when others said it was impossible. Lyanna held the fabric in her hands, running her fingers over the faded colors. Somewhere in the galaxy, her savior was living his life, probably not even remembering the child he rescued. She wished she could find him, could thank him, could tell him what his kindness meant, but she knew it was impossible. Too much time had passed, too many records were lost. The summit continued through its scheduled days. Tensions rose as difficult topics were addressed. There were moments when it seemed like the whole thing would collapse, when angry voices replaced diplomatic politeness. Kyle and other advisors worked behind the scenes, finding compromises and suggesting solutions. It was during one of these crisis moments that Kyle and Lyanna first spoke directly. A late-night emergency session had been called after a particularly bad day of negotiations. Representatives from both sides gathered in a smaller conference room, trying to salvage an agreement that seemed ready to fall apart. Kyle was there as a military advisor, providing context about security arrangements. Lyanna represented the Xylothian position on border monitoring. They ended up standing near each other as the meeting broke into smaller discussion groups. She spoke first, her human language accented but clear. She asked his opinion on a technical detail about patrol routes. Kyle answered professionally, keeping his response brief and focused. She nodded. The explosion shook the entire section of the station. Kyle was in his quarters reviewing documents when the blast wave hit, rattling the walls and causing the lights to flicker. Years of combat training took over instantly. He was moving before his conscious mind fully processed what happened, grabbing his emergency kit and heading for the door. Alarms screamed through the corridors. People ran in panic, not sure which direction was safe. Smoke poured from somewhere ahead, thick and acrid. Kyle pushed through the chaos, his voice calm and commanding as he directed civilians toward evacuation points. Some station security forces were already responding, but it was clear they were overwhelmed. He reached the blast site 5 minutes after the explosion. It was one of the smaller conference halls, now a smoking ruin. The door had been blown outward and debris littered the corridor. Emergency teams were pulling injured people from the wreckage. Kyle immediately joined them, using his military medical training to help the wounded. The explosion had happened during a scheduled break in negotiations. If it had occurred an hour earlier when the hall was full of delegates, dozens would be dead. That fact was not lost on anyone. This was not an accident. Someone had planted a bomb in the heart of the peace summit. Station security locked down the entire facility. No one could leave or enter while they investigated. Kyle found himself pulled into emergency meetings with security chiefs and diplomatic staff. His military experience made him valuable in the crisis, and soon he was coordinating with security teams to secure the rest of the station. It was during one of these emergency sessions that he encountered Liana again. She arrived with her own security detail, her face pale but composed. The bomb had exploded near the Xylothian delegation's wing. Several of her people were injured, though fortunately none killed. The station's security chief, a gruff human named Blake, addressed the gathered group. He explained what they knew so far, which was not much. The bomb had been sophisticated, designed to cause maximum damage. The timing suggested someone with inside knowledge of the summit schedule. They were looking at the possibility of multiple attackers still on the station. Blake made an announcement that nobody liked. He was forming a joint investigation task force, combining human and Xylothian security personnel. They needed to show both sides they were taking this seriously. He looked directly at Kyle and Liana as he spoke. Both of them would be assigned to lead their respective delegations on this task force. Kyle saw Liana's jaw tighten at the announcement, but she nodded acceptance. He felt much the same way. Neither of them wanted this assignment, but neither could refuse. Too much was at stake. If they did not find who was behind the bombing, the summit would collapse and war might follow. Their first meeting as partners was tense and formal. They gathered in a secure conference room with Blake and his senior investigators. Evidence was spread across the table. Fragments of the bomb, security footage, witness statements. Kyle studied it all with the practiced eye of someone who had seen too many explosions. Liana approached the evidence from a different angle. She focused on the timing and location, looking for patterns in who was targeted and who was spared. Her analytical mind worked quickly, making connections others might miss. Despite himself, Kyle was impressed by her intelligence. They divided the investigation into tasks. Kyle would coordinate with human security forces and military advisors, drawing on his combat experience to understand the technical aspects of the attack. Liana would interface with Xylothian intelligence services and diplomatic staff, looking for political motives and possible suspects. Over the next few days, they worked together constantly. At first, their interactions were purely professional and brief. Kyle would present findings about the bomb's construction. Liana would share intelligence about extremist groups. They coordinated but kept their distance, two people forced into partnership by necessity. But gradually, something began to change. It started with small moments. Kyle noticed how Liana drove herself relentlessly, working late into the station's artificial night, refusing to rest even when exhaustion showed in her face. It reminded him of himself at that age, pushing too hard because the mission mattered more than personal well-being. One evening, he found her alone in their shared investigation room, staring at security footage for the 20th time. She looked up as he entered, her eyes red from fatigue. Kyle did not say anything at first. He just made 2 cups of coffee using the room's small dispenser and set one in front of her. She looked at the cup, then at him, surprised by the simple gesture. She thanked him quietly and took a sip. They sat in silence for a moment, just 2 tired people trying to prevent disaster. Then Kyle asked her why she was pushing so hard. There were other people on the investigation team. She did not have to carry everything alone. Liana was quiet for a long moment before answering. She told him that she believed in this peace, truly believed it was possible. When she was a child, she said carefully, someone showed her that humans and Xylothians did not have to be enemies. That memory had guided her entire life. If this summit failed, if war came again, it would mean that belief was wrong. She could not let that happen. Kyle listened, feeling something stir in his chest. The way she spoke about that childhood memory. The emotion in her voice. He wanted to ask more, but the moment passed as another investigator entered with new information. The work continued. Their investigation led them deeper into station security networks. They discovered that the bomb had been brought aboard weeks ago, before the summit even began. Whoever planned this had been preparing for a long time. They also found evidence that suggested multiple devices might have been planted. The first explosion could have been a test or a diversion. This revelation sent the station into even higher alert. Security teams swept every section looking for more bombs. Delegates were confined to secured areas. The summit's schedule was suspended indefinitely. Tensions rose as people started pointing fingers, each side suspecting the other of harboring the terrorists. Kyle and Leanna found themselves working longer hours, often alone together as other team members rotated out for rest. The pressure of the situation stripped away some of their formal distance. They began to talk about more than just the investigation, sharing small pieces of their lives. Kyle told her about his years in the military, about the battles he survived and the friends he lost. He spoke carefully, editing out the worst parts, but she could hear the weight of those experiences in his voice. Leanna shared her own struggles, the political pressure she faced from conservative elements in her government who saw her progressive views as dangerous. During one long night of surveillance review, Kyle noticed Leanna rubbing her left forearm absently. It was a nervous habit, he realized. His eyes caught on the scar there, the one he had noticed before. Without thinking, he asked how she got it. Leanna looked down at her arm as if surprised to see her own hand there. She was quiet for a moment, then told him it was from the war. She had been caught in a bombing when she was very young. A building collapsed and she was trapped in the rubble. She did not remember much about it, just fragments. Fear and pain and smoke. Kyle felt his heart start to beat faster. He kept his voice carefully neutral as he asked where it happened. Leanna mentioned Kasara Prime 15 years ago. Kyle's hands tightened on the edge of the table. The pieces were starting to come together in his mind, connections forming that seemed impossible. He wanted to ask more, but another alarm interrupted them. Security had found something in a maintenance section. Everyone rushed to respond. The moment passed, but Kyle could not stop thinking about what Leanna had said. Kasara Prime 15 years ago, a child trapped in rubble. The discovered device turned out to be a false alarm, just old equipment that security had flagged incorrectly. But the incident showed how on edge everyone was. The station felt like a pressure cooker ready to explode. Fights broke out between delegates. Accusations flew. The fragile peace was cracking. Kyle and Leanna returned to their investigation with renewed urgency. They were running out of time. If they did not find the people behind the bombing soon, there would be no summit to save. Their partnership had evolved from reluctant cooperation to something more effective. They anticipated each other's thoughts, worked together smoothly, built on each other's ideas. Late one night, going through communication logs, Leanna found something important. There were coded messages between someone on the station and outside contacts. The encryption was sophisticated, but she recognized the pattern from intelligence briefings about extremist groups. She called Kyle over, excited by the discovery. They worked together to trace the messages, following digital breadcrumbs through the station's network. The trail led them to a surprising conclusion. The messages were not from human or Xylothian extremists working separately. They were from both groups coordinating together. Human and Xylothian terrorists were working as allies to destroy the peace. The irony was bitter. While delegates struggled to cooperate, their enemies had no such problems. Hate was a powerful unifier. Kyle and Leanna stared at their findings, understanding what it meant. This was not... Leanna could not sleep. She lay in her quarters staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through everything they had discovered. The investigation was moving forward. Suspects were identified, but something else bothered her. Something about Kyle Monroe that she could not quite grasp. She got up and moved to her desk, opening the small secure case she kept there. Inside was the piece of fabric she had carried for 15 years. In the dim light of her quarters, she held it carefully, studying the faded insignia for the 1,000th time. She had tried so many times to identify it, but military records from the war were incomplete or classified. But now she was on a station full of human military personnel and advisors. Now she had access to systems and databases that were not available before. The summit had opened doors, created connections. Maybe, just maybe, she could finally find answers. Liana spent the next hours searching through available military archives. She used her diplomatic credentials to access records that would normally be restricted. She entered search parameters. Kasara Prime, evacuation operations, dates matching her rescue. The database worked slowly, pulling files that were 15 years old. Results began appearing on her screen. Dozens of reports from that chaotic period. Unit movements, casualty lists, mission summaries. Most were heavily redacted, marked with security classifications that even her access could not bypass. But some information came through. Unit designations, commander names, operational areas. One name appeared repeatedly in the reports from the right time and place. Lieutenant Kyle Monroe, leading a special forces team in evacuation operations around the diplomatic compound area. Liana's heart started beating faster. She pulled up more files, searching for any information about this officer. There were service records, commendations, tactical reports. She found references to civilian rescues, to operations conducted under fire. Then she found something that made her stop breathing. A unit patch image attached to a personnel file. She enlarged it, comparing it to the fabric in her hand. They matched. Exactly. The colors, the design, every detail. This was the unit. This Lieutenant Kyle Monroe had been there that night. He might be the one who saved her. But was this the same Kyle Monroe she was working with now? 15 years was a long time. Officers advanced in rank were reassigned, retired. She checked current military records, cross-referencing with the summit's delegate roster. Commander Kyle Monroe retired from active duty, now serving as a civilian military advisor. Age and service history matched. It was him. The man who had been working beside her for days. The partner in her investigation was the soldier who pulled her from the rubble 15 years ago. Liana sat back in her chair, trembling. Her whole life had been shaped by what happened that night. Every decision she made, every belief she held about peace between their species, traced back to that moment when a human soldier chose compassion over hatred. And now he was here, right in front of her, and he did not even know who she was. She had to tell him. Had to confront him with this truth. But how? What would she say? "Thank you for saving my life" did not seem adequate. And what if he did not remember? He had probably rescued many people during the war. One alien child might not stand out in his memory. Liana made a decision. She would arrange a private meeting somewhere secure where they could talk without interruption. She would show him the fabric and ask directly if he recognized it. Whatever happened after that, at least she would know the truth. The next morning, she sent Kyle a message through their secure investigation channel. She requested a private meeting to discuss sensitive information related to their case. He agreed immediately, suggesting a secured conference room that afternoon. Liana spent the hours until then trying to prepare what she would say, but no words seemed right. Kyle arrived at the conference room on time, carrying a datapad with investigation notes. He seemed tired but focused, ready to discuss whatever new lead Liana had found. She was already there, standing by the window that showed the stars beyond the station. She turned as he entered, and he was surprised to see anxiety in her expression. He asked if something was wrong. Liana took a breath, then gestured for him to sit. This was not about the investigation, she told him. At least not directly. This was personal. Kyle's expression became guarded, but he sat down across from her, waiting. Liana reached into her pocket and pulled out the piece of fabric. She placed it on the table between them, her hand shaking slightly. She asked Kyle if he recognized it. He looked down at the worn cloth and his entire body went still. She saw the recognition in his eyes, saw the way his face changed as understanding hit him. Kyle reached out slowly and picked up the fabric, holding it like something fragile and precious. His voice was rough when he spoke. He asked where she got this. Liana told him the truth. It was torn from a uniform 15 years ago on Kasara Prime, from the soldier who saved her life when she was a child, trapped in a burning building. The silence in the room was heavy. Kyle looked from the fabric to Liana's face, really seeing her for the first time. The child he remembered had been so small, so scared, covered in dust and blood. But the eyes were the same. Those dark eyes that had looked at him with terror that slowly changed to trust. He had carried those eyes in his memory for 15 years. He said her name, but not the formal title. Just her name, spoken softly with a mixture of wonder and disbelief. He told her he remembered. He remembered pulling her from the rubble, remembered her small hand gripping his uniform, remembered carrying her through the fire to safety. He thought about her sometimes over the years, wondered if she survived, hoped she found peace. Liana felt tears in her eyes, but she did not try to hide them. She told him that she had searched for years to find him, that the memory of his kindness had shaped her entire life, that everything she believed about peace between humans and Xylothians came from that moment when he chose to save an enemy child, instead of leaving her to die. She trembled as she spoke, overwhelmed by finally having this conversation after so long. Kyle stood and moved around the table, and for a moment Liana was not sure what he would do. Then he opened his arms in an invitation, and she stepped into a careful embrace. It was brief but meaningful, two people acknowledging a bond formed in fire and blood. When they separated, Kyle sat down heavily, the weight of the revelation settling on him. He explained why he saved her. He told her about his younger sister who died in a bombing years before the war. How he could not save her but found himself unable to walk away from another child in danger. How in that moment species and sides did not matter. There was just a scared kid who needed help. Liana listened, understanding him better with every word. She asked why he took off his helmet that night, why he showed her his face. Kyle smiled sadly. He said he wanted her to see a person, not just an enemy soldier. He wanted her last memory, if she died, to be of someone who cared. He wanted to prove to himself that he was still human despite everything the war made him do. They talked for hours after that, sharing pieces of their lives. Kyle told her about the battles he survived, the nightmares that followed, the struggle to find meaning in civilian life after so much death. He spoke about how seeing her now, grown up and fighting for peace, was the first thing from that war that did not hurt to remember. Liana described her childhood after the rescue, how she was returned to her family but forever changed, how she faced prejudice from her own people for her beliefs about humans, how she pushed into politics and diplomacy because she had to prove that cooperation was possible. She told him he was her proof, her living example that the two species could care for each other. Kyle asked about her scar, the one he noticed weeks ago. Liana showed him her arm, explaining that she kept the injury as a reminder. She could have had it healed completely with advanced medical treatments, but she chose to keep it. The scar reminded her of that night, of the pain but also the rescue. It kept her grounded when politics got difficult. The conversation eventually returned to the present situation. They were in the middle of an investigation, standing between peace and war. Kyle said that knowing who she was made the stakes even higher. If they failed, if the summit collapsed, it would not just be a political failure. It would mean that his choice 15 years ago, the choice that saved her and shaped both their lives, led to nothing. Liana agreed. They had to stop the conspirators, had to save the summit, but now they were not just working together as assigned partners. They were two people bound by history, fighting to prove that compassion was stronger than hate. The personal had become inseparable from the mission. Before they left the conference room, Kyle took the piece of fabric and held it up next to his current uniform. The design was still the same, though his rank and decorations had changed. He carefully tore a matching piece from his sleeve and gave it to Liana. Now she had both pieces, a complete set, past and present joined together. They returned to their investigation with renewed purpose. Blake noticed something had changed between them, the way they worked even more smoothly together now. He did not ask questions, just appreciated that his best team was functioning better than ever. The operation began at dawn station time. Blake had assembled teams from both human and Xylothian security forces, the first time the two groups had worked together on something this critical. Kyle and Liana stood in the command center, coordinating the multiple moving pieces of their plan. The first phase was the arrests. They had identified 12 conspirators, 6 from each species, all positioned throughout the station. The arrests had to happen simultaneously, so none of them could warn the others or trigger the attack early. Security teams moved into position quietly, trying not to alert their targets. Kyle watched the tactical displays tracking each team's progress. Years of military experience let him see potential problems before they developed. He spoke calmly into his headset, adjusting positions and suggesting approaches. Beside him, Liana coordinated with Xylothian intelligence, providing background information on the suspects from their side. The first arrest went smoothly. A human technician was taken into custody in his quarters without resistance. Then a Xylothian scientist was arrested in a laboratory. Then another and another. Within 20 minutes, 10 of the 12 conspirators were in custody. But 2 remained, and these were the most dangerous. One was a human security officer named Grant who had access to restricted areas. The other was a Xylothian maintenance worker called Taven, who knew the station's infrastructure inside and out. These 2 had likely planted the bombs, and they were currently together in a service corridor near the main conference hall. Blake made the call to send teams after them, but Kyle stopped him. If they ran or fought, they might have time to detonate the bombs remotely. The devices had to be found and disabled first, then the arrests could proceed safely. Blake agreed but pointed out they had less than 3 hours before the summit session was scheduled to begin. Kyle and Liana volunteered to go themselves. They knew the investigation better than anyone else, knew what to look for and where the bombs might be hidden. Blake was reluctant, pointing out they were not combat operatives, but Kyle reminded him of his military background. And Liana had received security training as part of her diplomatic preparation. They were as qualified as anyone. Blake finally agreed, but he insisted they take backup. 4 security officers, 2 human and 2 Xylothian, would accompany them. The team assembled quickly, checking weapons and equipment. Kyle felt the familiar weight of combat gear, the readiness that years of training ingrained. It felt strange to be doing this again after so long. They moved through the station using service corridors to avoid being seen. The conference hall was in the central section, a massive room that could hold thousands of people. Kyle had reviewed the building plans extensively. There were dozens of places bombs could be hidden, but given the intercepted communications, he had narrowed it down to a few likely locations. The team split up to cover more ground. Kyle and Liana took one section, while the security officers searched others. They stayed in constant communication, reporting what they found. The hall was empty now, chairs arranged in neat rows, diplomatic banners hanging from the walls. It looked peaceful, but somewhere in this room were enough explosives to kill everyone who would gather here in a few hours. Liana checked behind access panels while Kyle examined the structural supports. They worked methodically, fighting the pressure to rush. One mistake, one overlooked hiding spot, and people would die. Kyle tried not to think about the stakes, focusing only on the immediate task. That was how you survived combat, by keeping your mind on what was in front of you. One of the security officers called in. She had found something behind a ventilation grate, a package that should not be there. Kyle and Liana rushed to her position. The device was sophisticated, a shaped charge designed to bring down the ceiling. Kyle examined it carefully without touching anything. It had a timer and a remote trigger. They needed a bomb disposal expert. Blake dispatched specialists, but they were 20 minutes away. Kyle made a decision. He had dealt with explosives during the war, not as an expert, but enough to be dangerous. He could disable the timer if he was careful. Liana started to protest, but he cut her off gently. They did not have time to wait, and he was not going to let this bomb stay active. He worked slowly, his hands steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Liana watched, ready to help if needed. The other security officers cleared the area, following protocol. Kyle identified the timer circuit and traced the connections. Standard military design, similar to devices he had seen before. He found the right wire and carefully cut it. The timer display went dark. The bomb was neutralized, one down, but there had to be more. The conspirators would not rely on a single device. Kyle and Liana continued their search with renewed urgency. Another team found a second bomb near the stage where speakers would stand. The specialists arrived and began disabling it properly, while Kyle's team searched for more. That was when everything went wrong. Grant and Taven, the 2 remaining conspirators, realized something was happening. They appeared at the far end of the conference hall, weapons drawn. Grant shouted for everyone to stop moving. Taven held up a remote device, his finger hovering over a button. One more bomb, he announced, and this trigger would detonate it. Kyle raised his hand slowly, signaling his team to do the same. The situation had just become a hostage scenario. Grant and Taven were desperate now, their plan falling apart. Desperate people made mistakes, but they also did unpredictable things. Kyle needed to keep them talking, buy time for Blake's teams to respond. He spoke calmly, asking what they wanted. Grant laughed bitterly. They wanted the summit to fail, he said. They wanted war to continue because peace was a lie. Humans and Xylothians could never truly coexist. The war proved that, and ending it was just delaying the inevitable next conflict. Lyanna stepped forward slightly, her voice calm and clear. She told them they were wrong. Peace was possible because she was living proof. She explained about her rescue during the war, about the human soldier who saved her when he could have left her to die. She pointed to Kyle, identifying him as that soldier. Grant and Taven seemed thrown by this revelation. Lyanna kept talking, her words gaining strength. She told them that if a soldier in the middle of a battle could show compassion to an enemy child, then peace was not just possible, but necessary. The cycle of hatred had to end somewhere, and it would end with people choosing differently. For a moment, Kyle thought it might work. Taven's hand lowered slightly, doubt crossing his face. But Grant was too far gone, too committed to his hatred. He raised his weapon and fired. Kyle moved instantly, pulling Lyanna behind cover as the shot went wide. The conference hall erupted in chaos. Security officers returned fire while Kyle shielded Lyanna with his body. More shots echoed through the hall. Kyle heard someone cry out in pain. The situation was deteriorating fast. He needed to end this before more people got hurt or that bomb detonated. Kyle spotted a service door behind Grant and Taven. If he could flank them, get them from an unexpected angle, he might be able to stop this. He told Lyanna to stay down and handed her his sidearm. Then he was moving, using the cover of seats and pillars to work his way around. It felt like being back in the war, that terrible clarity that came with combat. Everything slowed down. Every movement was calculated. Kyle's training took over, muscle memory from years of fighting. He reached the service door and slipped through, finding himself in a maintenance corridor that ran behind the stage. He emerged behind the conspirators just as Grant was lining up another shot at the security officers. Kyle hit him from behind, tackling him to the ground. Grant's weapon skittered away across the floor. They struggled, Grant fighting with desperate strength. Kyle was older now, not as fast as he once was, but he had experience and determination. Taven turned, the remote still in his hand. Lyanna appeared from her cover, the weapon Kyle gave her aimed steadily at the Xylothian. She ordered him to drop the remote. Taven looked at her, this young princess who was supposed to be on his side. She stood firm, not wavering. Taven made his choice. He dropped the remote device and raised his hands in surrender. Security officers rushed forward, securing both conspirators. Kyle pushed himself up from the floor, breathing hard. Lyanna lowered her weapon, her hands shaking slightly now that the immediate danger had passed. The bomb specialists retrieved the remote and used it to locate the final device. It was hidden in the ceiling, larger than the others. If it had detonated, the entire section of the station would have been destroyed. They began the careful process of disabling it, while medics treated the wounded. Miraculously, no one had been killed. Blake arrived with reinforcements, but the situation was already under control. He looked at Kyle and Lyanna with something like awe. They had done it. They stopped the attack, captured the conspirators, and saved the summit. He began coordinating the cleanup and processing of prisoners, leaving Kyle and Lyanna standing in the middle of the conference hall. Kyle checked Lyanna for injuries, his hands gentle but thorough. She was fine, just shaken. She had never been in combat before. Never had someone shoot at her. The reality of what almost happened was sinking in. Kyle understood. The first time was always the hardest. The summit reconvened 2 days after the attack was stopped. The conference hall had been thoroughly searched and secured. Armed guards stood at every entrance, and security protocols were tighter than ever. But the delegates came back shaken but determined. The conspiracy had been exposed. The perpetrators were in custody, and both sides understood how close they had come to disaster. Kyle sat in the observation section, watching the proceedings. He was not directly involved in the negotiations, but his presence had been requested by both delegations. The story of his role in stopping the attack had spread through the station. People looked at him differently now, with respect and gratitude. He was uncomfortable with the attention. Liana was at the main table, representing the Xylothian position alongside senior diplomats. She looked calm and professional, but Kyle could see the tension in her shoulders. The negotiations had reached a critical point. Both sides were arguing over the final details of the treaty, the language that would define peace for years to come. The talks went on for hours. There were moments when it seemed like everything would fall apart over a single word or phrase. But then someone would offer a compromise, another would accept, and progress continued. Kyle realized he was watching history being made, the slow and difficult work of building peace between enemies. During a break, Liana caught his eye across the hall. She gave him a small smile, barely visible to anyone else. It was enough. They had come so far from that first night when he pulled her from the rubble. Two people whose lives were changed by war, now working together to prevent more suffering. The breakthrough came late in the afternoon. A Xylothian elder diplomat proposed new language for a disputed section, wording that addressed both sides' concerns. The human ambassador considered it, consulted with advisors, then agreed. Other issues fell into place after that, compromises building on compromises. By evening, they had a complete draft treaty. The signing ceremony was scheduled for the next day. That night, Kyle stood alone on an observation deck, looking out at the stars. So much of his life had been spent fighting under those stars, seeing them from battleships and war zones. Now they looked peaceful, beautiful even. He wondered if that was real or just his hope projecting onto the universe. Footsteps behind him announced another person's arrival. He did not need to turn to know it was Liana. She came to stand beside him at the window, her reflection visible in the glass. For a while, neither spoke. They just stood together, two people who had been through impossible things. Liana broke the silence first. She thanked him, not just for stopping the attack, but for everything. For saving her as a child, for showing her that compassion was possible across species lines, for being the foundation of her belief in peace. Her voice was soft but filled with emotion. Kyle turned to face her. He told her she did not need to thank him. She had become exactly the kind of person the galaxy needed. Someone willing to fight for understanding instead of dominance. He said that if the peace held, if humans and Xylothians built something lasting, it would be because of people like her making the hard choices. She smiled, but there was sadness in it. She asked what he would do after the summit ended. Kyle admitted he was not sure. Return to Earth, probably. Back to his quiet life of teaching young officers. Try to forget that for a brief time, he had been in the middle of something important again. Liana was quiet for a moment, then told him about a position in the new Permanent Peace Commission that would be established after the treaty was signed. They would need advisors who understood both military and diplomatic matters, people both sides could trust. She thought he would be perfect for it. Kyle started to refuse automatically. He had left that world behind, was done with politics and negotiations. But Liana stopped him with a gentle touch on his arm. She reminded him that he once told her some things were worth fighting for. Peace was one of them. They had saved the summit together. Should they not help protect what it created? He looked at her face, seeing the determination and hope there. She believed so completely in what they were building. How could he walk away from that? Maybe his fighting days were not over, just different now. Maybe this was what he was meant to do with all the experience and pain from the war. Kyle told her he would think about it. Liana accepted that with a nod. She understood that people needed time to make big decisions. Before she left, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the two pieces of fabric, the one she had carried for 15 years and the one Kyle gave her. She had sewn them together into a single piece. She handed it back to him. She said it belonged to them both now, a symbol of everything they had been through and everything they hoped to build. Kyle took it carefully, feeling the weight of history in that small piece of cloth. He promised to keep it safe, to remember what it represented. The signing ceremony the next day was formal and grand. Representatives from both governments stood on the stage, witnesses from dozens of other species filling the hall. The treaty was read aloud in both languages, every word carefully chosen and weighted with meaning. Then, one by one, the officials signed their names. Kyle watched from the audience as Leanna added her signature to the document. Her hand was steady, her expression serious. This was her life's work made real, the belief she held since childhood now written into law. When she finished, she looked out into the crowd and found Kyle's face. He nodded once, a gesture of respect and pride. The hall erupted in applause when the last signature was added. People stood cheering and celebrating. Some were crying, overcome by emotion. It was not a perfect treaty, and the peace it created would be fragile for years, but it was real. It was a start. That was more than anyone dared hope for during the dark years of war. After the ceremony, there were celebrations throughout the station. Delegates mingled freely, the formal barriers breaking down in the moment of shared achievement. Kyle found himself surrounded by people wanting to shake his hand, to thank him for his role in protecting the summit. He accepted their gratitude with grace but felt uncomfortable being treated as a hero. He slipped away when he could, finding a quiet corridor away from the crowds. He needed a moment to process everything that had happened. In a few weeks, he had gone from a retired soldier living a quiet life to someone at the center of historic events. His past had collided with the present in ways he never imagined possible. Over the following days, delegates began leaving the station, returning to their homes to implement the treaty. Kyle prepared to leave as well, booking passage on a ship back to Earth. But his conversation with Leanna kept playing in his mind. The offer to join the Peace Commission, the chance to be part of something lasting. On his last night at Meridian Point, Kyle made his decision. He sent a message to the Commission's organizing committee, accepting the advisory position. It felt right in a way he had not expected. He was tired of running from his past, tired of trying to forget. Maybe it was time to use everything he learned to build something good. He saw Leanna one final time before his departure. She was staying on the station for a few more weeks, helping establish the Commission's initial protocols. They met in the same observation deck where they talked before, standing at the window looking at stars. Kyle told her he accepted the position. Leanna's face lit up with genuine joy. She told him it was the right choice, that the Commission needed someone with his experience and perspective. More than that, she was glad they would continue working together. They had become a good team, he agreed. They had complementary skills and shared the same goal. But more than that, they understood each other in a way few people could. Their bond was forged in fire and tested in danger. It was a friendship that transcended species and history. Before Kyle left, Leanna gave him something. It was a small badge newly designed for the Peace Commission. The emblem combined human and Xylothian symbols in a way that honored both cultures. She pinned it to his jacket herself, her movements formal but her smile warm. Kyle looked down at the badge, then back at Leanna. He told her that when he pulled her from that building 15 years ago, he never imagined it would lead here. All he wanted was to save one life in a war that took so many. He had no idea that small act would grow into something so much larger. Leanna's voice was soft when she replied. She said that was how peace was built. One small choice at a time. One person deciding to show compassion instead of hatred. One act of courage inspiring others. The treaty they just signed was important, but it was made possible by countless small decisions made by individuals who chose differently. Kyle understood. He was just one soldier who made one choice, but that choice rippled outward in ways he could not predict. It changed Leanna's life, shaped her beliefs, brought her to this place where she could influence the future of two species. And through her, his choice had helped create this peace. They said their goodbyes, knowing it was not forever. They would see each other again when the Commission began its work in a few months. Kyle boarded his ship and watched through the viewport as Meridian Point grew smaller in the distance. The station where so much happened, where past and present collided, where peace was saved and signed.